This is the lecture, Who Do You Say I Am? And it's on Christian iconography, particularly the life of Christ. I've been asked by students when I'm at the museum, how come there's so much religious art? The Roman Catholic Church was powerful for centuries, still pretty powerful actually, and they certainly supported many, many artists with their commissions. So many of the churches in Rome are unbelievable. And so church was very much central to life for centuries. It really wasn't until the 1400s that you even started to see genre works or secular works. Everything was pretty based around the church, at least Western perspective. So sometimes it's necessary to have an understanding of Christian traditions in order to understand the artworks. In a similar way, for instance, I have a Buddhist art lecture, and you need to have a little bit of background on Buddhist art in order to read the art, in order to understand the background. So this is a Life of Christ in Art, and it takes you basically through the Annunciation to the end, the crucifixion. And so, in any case, I'm just going to start and get going and go through it, and there's a lot of truly gorgeous works. Who do you say I am? The Apostle Paul stated, all things to all men. To some, Jesus is the Son of God, the anointed, the Christ, born to a virgin more than 2,000 years ago. Birth is believed to be, by most scholars, around 4 before Common Era. To others, he was just a man. Some religions consider him a prophet. Most believe he almost certainly did exist. So I've given you several points of view there. This is Head of Christ by Warner Salmon, 1940. And I think when a lot of people think of Christ, this might be the image that pops in their mind. If you've gone to a children's Bible study, or if you have participated in some sort of Christian class, chances are you've seen this image. It's still pretty iconic. So Jesus Christ, Anointed One, Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, regarded by Christians as fulfilling Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah. And so this is Raphael's Christ. Raphael is a Renaissance artist. And here you see the figure of Jesus holding his hand up in a blessing. And he's also pointing at the wounds on his chest as well. This is a very famous work and very much in the style of Raphael, who was painting very realistically. And he's truly known for his beautiful anatomy and his detail. And so this is, I think it's a pretty important image of Christ. Perhaps more famously is the one, the other one, and this is called Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World. And this went for an astounding $450 million. And so last I checked, it's still at the top of the list as far as auction prices. It's a phenomenal number. And some believe it is by Leonardo da Vinci. Some are still arguing about it. But somebody paid $450 million for it, so they're pretty sure about it. Here's some detail of it. Certainly the hands are gorgeous, and Leonardo's hands are incredible. And here he has this globe as a symbol of the world. Again, his hand is up in a blessing. It's front forward gaze. And I think it's kind of the archetypal face of Jesus we have come to expect. Was he blonde with blue eyes? Not likely. Did he have brown hair and brown eyes? Maybe. Maybe they were green eyes. Possibly. Was his skin light? Was it dark? Perhaps. They don't really know. And so certainly I think that's part of one of the questions that I was asking is there are so many faces of Jesus in art. So who bought it? We do not comment on the identities of the buyers. I'm sorry. The bids came from every part of the world, and this is from Christie's, and this was in 2007. Coming down to the Virgin, and there are 7 rays coming off of the Holy Spirit, the symbol, the dove symbol, and that represents the 7 fruits of the Spirit. So 7, 3, these are numbers that recur in Christianity, 12, 12 tribes of Israel. And then behind the Virgin, you see the 3 sets of windows, symbols of light. Light imagery also occurs in Christianity quite a bit. And that will represent the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And you have classical details. Those columns are very classical. But the flooring is actually from scenes of the Old Testament. So really, really interesting, the details of this work. So the inscriptions say, "Hail, full of grace, and behold, the handmaiden of the Lord." But the best detail on this entire thing, I think, is why are the words upside down? Think about it a little bit. So their words are written upside down on this painting, and so upside down and backwards. Now think about it. This is a painting to glorify God, so these are words that God can read. Now mind you, God should be able to read it any which way you put it, upward, downward, encoded, whatever. But I still think it's a fascinating detail, a gorgeous, gorgeous detail. And this is a masterpiece in art history. The book that's in front of her would be a book such as the Bible, or also possibly a book of Hours. Book of Hours would be a prayer book in this time period. It was often dedicated to a person's saint, or the Virgin, and the wealthy people had Book of Hours, and so these would include kind of a calendar, a meditations, different thoughts for different days, and these would have all been hand produced. These were extremely valuable. So if you had a Book of Hours, you were wealthy. If you had a book, period, you were wealthy. So here's some of the details close up, so you can see some of the fine details of this. Again, this is late medieval, early Renaissance, North. So the rainbow-winged angel is more typical in medieval period. The angel as we know her looks quite different from this, this is very realistic. Very, very detailed. He was a miniaturist artist. This would have taken a long time. You have these rays coming in from this window. You have the Holy Spirit coming down. You have all these rich details. The rainbow wings also denote peacock feathers, a symbol of resurrection. Peacock was also a symbol for the wife of Zeus, Hera, who endured a husband that cheated on her a lot, which is pretty ironic because Zeus was the god of marriage. So, yet there was lots of problems with that. That's like making Bill Clinton the god of marriage. But in any case, the rainbow wings denote resurrection. St. Augustine is said to have noted that the peacock flesh did not decay as quickly as other meats, and that peacock feathers themselves they lose their feathers and then they get more. So they also are resurrection. So that's one of the reasons why they're sometimes a symbol of resurrection. As is the pomegranate. Pomegranates also are a symbol of resurrection as well. But that's another story. Okay. Leonardo da Vinci's gorgeous Annunciation of the Virgin. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary to announce that she will be the mother of the Christ child. And this is an early work. He doesn't have quite the naturalism that he's going to get later. And the format is interesting, as if it perhaps was over a bed or had a very specific place that it was going to be. And she is in, remember, the Virgin are often in red, white, or blue. And here she is in blue for Queen of Heaven, and also red to symbolize the passion or the blood of Christ. And here his wings have a little color on them, but they're mostly gold and a little bit more subtle. And the angel is holding his hand up in a blessing to Mary, and she looks startled. And then you see her hand is also on this book, and the book appears to have like a shroud around it. Again, sometimes a beautiful cloth would be used to because it was a sacred book. The background is very, very stylized, which I think is interesting as well, as are the flowers, as are the details. And so this is Annunciation of the Virgin, or the announcement to the Virgin. Now the halo is interesting. He was one to starts using these delicate halos. And so here again, she is receiving this information. She looks a little startled, but she's still taking it all in. So she was also betrothed to Joseph, who was much older than her. He was a carpenter. And so it's also a question of faith and trust. But I want to talk a little bit more about halos. So halos, nimbuses, lotus framing devices, or iconography show up as part of many religious traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, and others. And so this idea of the halo, how old is it? It's very old. Indeed, the halo actually shows up in images of Helios, the sun god, riding his chariot across the sky, 5th century before Common Era. And so this is an example of a Greek red figure vase. And Michelangelo's Moses with his horns of light. These horns were actually from St. Jerome in the Vulgate translation, actually said that Moses came down after receiving the 10 Commandments with these horns, these kind of wizened horns. And this idea of horns and leadership and enlightenment also comes from the Greco-Roman tradition. There are images of Alexander the Great as Zeus Amon with horns. This is a Gandhara Buddha. It shows the classical influence of Greco-Roman style as well, with the rather classicized robe. But this is a Buddhist example, and it does have the halo as well. And again, sometimes it's framed with flower petals in a lotus style, sometimes the lotus point, sometimes it's rounded. And this is around 1st, 2nd century. Justinian Byzantine mosaic, 6th century. Again, just a very simple simple halo on this beautiful mosaic. And these are little tiny glass mosaics that would be on this wall, not the flooring so much as this is on a wall. and these would be tilted just so that it would glisten, so that it would reflect light. And these little tiny mosaic pieces are called tessera. The halo, a divine disc in Christian iconography, but it did exist long before. There's even traditions of square halos and triangular halos, and the one in the corner is one of the popes that was shown in 8th century. Philadelphia Museum of Art, Schiavo, and this is also known as Paolo de Stefani Baldoloni, not a particularly well-known painting. And this is kind of, it's Italian, it's early Renaissance, and it still has a lot of stiffness that's more related to the medieval period. You don't have a strong sense of space going in. It's very, very stylized, gorgeous halos. And here are the figures of the Virgin. She's coming to see her cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth was much older, and it was surprising that Elizabeth had conceived. Very surprising, because she was, again, much older. So she conceives John the Baptist, and of course the Virgin is with the Christ child. And it's that moment when the cousins are meeting and they're embracing. And according to some church doctrines and some of the apocryphal stories, the children, the infants, were moving in their wombs as well, as if they recognized each other. So again, this is visitation of the Virgin. And this visitation is sometimes called the greeting as well. Fra Angelico, coronation of the Virgin. This is 15th century. And so here you see, you don't see a full development of space. This is late medieval, early Renaissance. But you are starting to see this sense of space going in. One of the reasons it's not as realistic as oil painting is because it's done in tempera. It's an egg-based paint. And it doesn't have the layers. It doesn't have the contours that you get with oil painting. And so here you see the Virgin with Christ child and 6 angels on the predella. And so the predella is the base. The predella is the frame on the very, very bottom. Sometimes it's at the bottom of the altar, and that term is called a predella. So Burne-Jones is still Pre-Raphaelite, but more second phase of the Pre-Raphaelites. So associated Pre-Raphaelites, William Morris, who was who did a number of textiles. This was the Pre-Raphaelites were a group of young males that were interested in painting beautiful females. They wanted to paint in a style before Raphael. They wanted to paint in more of a medieval aesthetic, more of a stained glass aesthetic. And so they didn't necessarily want the space to be exact. They again wanted a little bit more freedom. Let me move on. Pontormo's Visitation or Greeting, and this is an artist that was active in the 1500s, and it's a fresco that has been restored and actually put on this large panel. It was on display at the Getty a couple of years ago. Beautiful, beautiful image. The color is somewhere in between these two images. That's one of the hard things about art history, is trying to find the right slides, because depending on the slides, the colors can be quite different, but it's kind of in between the two. And so the 4 figures represented were organized, and they were inspired by Durer's engraving of the 4 witches, ironically enough, because this is the Virgin and the Virgin's cousin and two attendants. And you're kind of entering the scene, almost completing the circle to a certain degree. And let me move on. So here you can see Dürer's print of the four witches. Dürer is Northern Renaissance. He's an important German printmaker. And you can also see the preparatory drawing of this grouping. Now, Pontormo's work has a lot of mannerism. The women look like they're 8 feet tall. Their forms are elongated. They're stretched in a very artistic way. And so sometimes it's not realistic, but it's very expressive. Bill Viola did the greeting. Remember, the greeting, the visitation, both are the same. It's a 1995 video performance art for the Venice Biennale. This is that moment when the pregnant Mary visits her cousin. Again, they greet each other, and there's actually a video going, and then you actually hear this kind of mystical over voice. Can you see me? Can you hear me? It's really haunting. There are clips of it on YouTube as well. And so he was also inspired by this particular work, particularly the flowing garments, because in the video, her garments are moving. He's also contemporized it. So she looks more contemporary. She looks more today. And so I think that's intriguing. So mannerism defined an art style of the late 16th century, but mannerism still recurs, characterized by this spatial incongruity and elongation of forms. It can be a stretched out thigh or a long neck, or sometimes long, elegant feet. These are things that are sometimes done in mannerism. This painting has to do with the birth of Christ, of course. And we have here an angel in pale blue, which is a little different. I think we more often expect them to be in white. And then here you see these shepherds are so startled by this vision. Jesus is born at night in Bethlehem, placed in a basket. Mary and her husband marvel at the newborn, while an angel announces the birth of the Savior to shepherds in a field who rush to adore the child. And so it's this moment of great surprise. So this is Jules Bastien-Lepage, Annunciation to the Shepherds. Realist artist, naturalist, more academic art, and this is 19th century. So there's adoration, tribute, and it's a biblical story. Shepherds directed to go. And Giotto, this work was produced in the early 1300s. He's a Florentine artist, Italian, medieval, the adoration of the Magi. So he's credited with some of the first accurate depictions of space in art and perspective. There is a sense of 3D in a 2D space, still not as developed as you're going to get in the Renaissance with Leonardo and others, but moving that direction. Vasari said of Giotto that he made a decisive break with the Byzantine style and brought to life the great art of painting as we know it today, which was during the Renaissance times, introducing the technique of drawing accurately from life. And so here, again, he's talking about the figures have a realism to them. They're going to get more so, but even so, the realism is very much present in this work. Adoration of the Magi by Bruegel, the elder, 1598 to 1600. Flemish artist, Northern Renaissance. And here you can see there is this exotic details of the Magi coming in who are darker skinned and wearing really rich clothes as well. And there are dignitaries bowing down to the Christ child. Yet the place where the baby was born, a stable, looks very, very humble. So here is a detail of it so you can see it closer up. Lots of figures. This is very, very typical of Bruegel. Lots and lots of figures. And so here you see great crowds have come to see the Christ child, which is a little different than the biblical passages, but even so, really quite beautiful and detailed. So they have numerous retinues with them, and they're visiting the Christ child in a tumble-down farm in Bethlehem. But this painting is actually small, and it's done on copper, and so that also gives it a unique quality as well. He painted 3 similar versions. I personally have a preference for this one, but again, they're all quite unique. This one has a pretty palette. The sky is a unique color as well. You see that little smoky background that's reminiscent of the style that was evident with Da Vinci. This kind of smoky sfumato background. And the figures again are very, very detailed. And this would have taken time. This would have been something that was very, very meticulously rendered. Here you can see adoration of the kings, and this is color on vellum. And so really quite remarkable that something exists on vellum from 1598. So these would be things that you would have to be very, very careful with. Very fragile. So here you can see the different versions. So there was a market for this. There was a market for these stories. And mind you, not everybody was literate. In fact, only the upper classes would be literate. And these were visual stories. These were something that people could read. And so there was definitely a great appeal for that. By the time you get to printmaking, that also spreads a lot of ideas, and that's around, that's in the 1400s. Now, the 3 magi traditionally brought the Christ child gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These would have been rich things that they were giving the parents, basically. And again, this is Northern Renaissance, and this is a center panel by Hieronymus Bosch. One of the kind of unusual things about it is the half-dressed man who's kind of inside of this ramshackle home, and then you also have this figure on top of the roof as well. You still have the very exotic magi there also, the dark-skinned magi, and the scripture is from Psalms 71:10. The kings of Tharsis and the islands shall offer presents. The kings of the Arabians and the Saba shall bring him gifts, and all the kings of the earth shall adore him. So Peter Erickson, middle panel of a triptych, the Adoration of the Magi. And this also includes the detail of an obscure naked man in the background. Now, there's some thought that they added these details to show their artistic skill, to show their ability as an artist. But it's still interesting. So again, in the background, you see the servants in the back. Well, one is naked, one is half naked. It's interesting, and then they're by the pillars as well, and it's an interesting detail. And they're not entirely sure why, but here again we also see King Melchior offering gold, and there's only one king on this panel, The other kings were on the other panels, but one of the panels is lost. This is from Signs and Symbols in Christian Art, and it's a classic by George Ferguson. There's many different editions of it, and it's a classic in art history. I think most art historians have the copy. Flight in Egypt. When Herod the king heard that the child had been born, who would become king of the Jews, he was angry and sought to find the child in order that he might be destroyed. But an angel appeared to Joseph, which we see, and warned him to take the infant Jesus and flee into Egypt to escape from Herod. The Holy Family is, of course, called Flight into Egypt. This is a scene that is reproduced numerous times in art history. So again, to show her humility, she is indeed on a donkey. She holds the infant in her arms. Here the infant's kind of large, which is interesting too. And they're shown leaving Bethlehem while the massacre of the young children decreed by Herod in order to destroy the Christ child is taking place. And this was the death of the firstborn males, the massacre of the innocents. And so this is, again, from Ferguson, which is really, really good if you love art history and want the backstory. Rest on the flight into Egypt. And so here it's rather idyllic. And you see these angels dancing around, and you see the Christ child on the very, very youthful looking Mary, and she's in red, white, and blue. And so again, common iconography. And then in the background you have Joseph, who is looking at a book. And so this is done in the classical tradition. Gerard David, Rest on the Flight into Egypt, another example. And so in the top corner you see a youthful virgin and child. And here the child, this is not a Raphael child. It doesn't have that fullness, that naturalism that you're going to get with Raphael's beautiful babies. But you can certainly see that they're moving out of the medieval, and it's certainly looking more realistic. So Netherlands, Dutch artist, idealized forms. The baby is a little older than biblical text would dictate. And so, and this is, again, the escape of Joseph and Mary. Early work, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, known as Caravaggio. So Baroque, Italian, and he had a very impetuous personality. Certainly he was known to have a temper, and he was known for his naturalism. His later works have a darker tonality and really, really sharp chiaroscuro or light dark contrast, but this is, again, earlier. It's still beautiful, and so here you have an angel that is entertaining the Holy Family on the flight into Egypt. The richness of the details, the fabrications are twirling. This is one of the features of the Baroque, and it will even get more developed as time goes on. So this is an apocryphal legend, and despite prohibitive degrees of from the Council of Trent about rules about what should be shown in art, this was a popular theme. He uses the figure of an angel with his back to the viewer to divide the composition, which is interesting, especially because the wings are a little dark, and they almost look a little too moved over, almost separate from the angel. And Giorgione, like Landscape is in the back, so he's looking back to the classical Renaissance past. But the earth tones, the palette, the limited palette of oranges and ambers and browns, this is very typical of Caravaggio. Gaulli, better known as Bosciccio, St. Joseph and the Infant Christ. This is at the Norton Simon. And it shows this wonder of the infant Christ. It's one of my favorite works at the Norton Simon. Caravaggio background here. You can see here is a Giorgione who trained Titian, and this is his three philosophers. And the background you can compare to the background in the Caravaggio, and they're definitely connected with one another. This is sometimes called the three philosophers, and it's sometimes called the three ages of man, because you have a youthful man, you have a middle-aged man, and you have an older man. And the youth is kind of has this dreamy, idealized expression on his face, and the middle-aged man is more neutral, and then, of course, the older man is more wise. So, St. Joseph and the Infant Christ, again, this is Norton Simon. It's a stunning work, it truly is. And so he definitely shows the influence of Caravaggio with that dark tonal background, and also Bernini, because there's such a sculptural quality to the garments themselves. But here Joseph is looking at the wonder of this Christ child who literally glows. You can see the rays coming off of him. Bernini is said to have also been an influence of this one because, again, look at the dramatic folds of this particular work. And this is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Gorgeous work. It is Saint Teresa of Avila was a woman that had visions, and these were so real and so intense that it was almost like a sexual experience. And so if you look at this and think, wow, what's going on here? Yes, it's very, very notable that she is in ecstasy. And then the angel is kind of holding back his arrow of love and passion, and he has kind of a smirk on his face almost. And she was actually said to be able to levitate, that when she would pray, she was so prayerful and so close to God that she would actually levitate off the ground. So she was a mystic. So what is Baroque? Associated with the 17th, 18th century. Style and art and architecture is dramatic, often bold, curving forms, elaborate ornamentations, you could say gaudy sometimes, extravagant, ornamental, bizarre, theatrical, does not have balance in classical style, but it's often most associated, I think, to a certain degree. Presentation in the temple, and here we also have Giotto, Proto-Renaissance, early Renaissance, late medieval. This is part of Jewish tradition. Mary and Joseph bring their firstborn son to the temple in Jerusalem, where the aged Simeon recognizes Jesus as the prophet and savior of humankind. And so this is also a common theme in art history in the life of Jesus. So here you see two pairs of standing figures flank this ciborium, this kind of architectural feature that's typical of Giotto, that symbolizes the Temple of Jerusalem. So following the Gospel of Luke, the artist has demonstrated the dramatic moment when Simeon and the prophetess Anna recognize the Christ child as the Savior. And this source is from the Isabel Gardner Museum. Lorenzo Ghiberti, Gates of Paradise. This is 1400s. It's in Florence and it's next to the beautiful Duomo Cathedral and museum. It was for baptisms, and the beginning of Christ's ministry was marked by his baptism at age 30. He was baptized by John the Baptist, who was also his cousin and the son of Elizabeth. Baptized in the Jordan River, and God's voice comes down and proclaims him as his son. Now, above the gates of paradise, you can see a sculptural figure of the Christ. You can see a John the Baptist figure who is baptizing Christ, and then you also have an angel that's looking upon this event. And then there's a cool self-portrait of the artist, and this is Lorenzo Ghiberti. And it's kind of cool just the way he inserts himself literally in this sculpture. What is on there now is not the original. It is a copy. The original is kept inside of the Duomo Museum. And the Duomo Museum is something that's really not to be missed. It's gorgeous and often overlooked. This is Old Testament subject matter. New Testament subject matter is on top, with Christ being baptized. And there was a juried competition to determine who would do the commission, and Ghiberti is the one who won. So the voice of God, or the Spirit of God, comes down like a dove, and a voice says and proclaims, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And it demonstrates that moment. And here you can see the figures close up. There are only two examples that remain from the competition, Filippo Brunelleschi's and Lorenzo Ghiberti's Sacrifice of Isaac. And he won. So there's a little more to the story, but I think for the purposes of this lecture, that's good. So here you can see the exterior of the baptistery in Florence. And it's lavish and gold inside, and it's absolutely stunning. And then here is the detail of the Christ figure. And it's very classicizing because, of course, you see the classical columns around him, the Corinthian columns around him. Calling of St. Matthew, you have a strong diagonal. It adds interest. He's pointing at Matthew, who was here he's called Levi, and he was a tax collector, and he's asking him to go and follow him and these apostles of Christ. And he's pointing at himself like, who, me? There's an older man kind of bending down with glasses. Glasses, they believe, first glasses were used probably around the 1300s. There is a figure of a male looking down, and he seems more focused on his worldly possessions. He's not seeing any of what's going on. And then there's the two youths that are, one of them's kind of startled and looking at him. One's rather beautiful, and then the other one is kind of reaching for his sword as these people startle him. The two young males on the end, it's believed this is the style of dress that Caravaggio would have dressed in. He was a very flamboyant personality, a kind of wild personality, and now they think that it's entirely possible that his behavior was due to lead poisoning that was in the paint. Christ's hand, that gesture, is one that is associated with the central panel in the Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam. So he becomes the new Adam in the New Testament. And he's next, Peter is next to him, and they're in more traditional biblical dress, whereas again, in contrast to the other individuals that are in more contemporary dress. One of the things also that's very important about this work is that spotted spiritual light. and Counting House Tavern, we're not entirely sure. And then you don't see the detail of the feet, but Christ is pointing and is turning at the same time. You can see his feet moving towards the viewer. But it's a gorgeous work, and it is inside of a church, and it's very large. So here it is as you can see the whole thing, and then you can also see a detail of the work as well. But brown tonal background, lots of golds, lots of ambers. Again, very typical of Caravaggio. Lots of naturalism. And it is a stunning work. It's undescribable. In the church where it's at, there's actually a machine where you sit there and feed it euros, and then it shines a light on it so that you can see it better. And literally, a group of people will kind of stand around it and take turns putting in the euros in it, which it's kind of interesting to see a euro machine in front of a side chapel in a church. But again, churches need a lot to keep this to keep up as far as restoration work. So here's that detail that I'm talking about. This is from the center panel, Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and so he would have been very aware of his predecessor. They share the same name, and the detail is certainly intriguing and kind of psychological as well. Raphael's Transfiguration, 1500s, oil on panel. Plenty of artistic license here. It departs from the scripture. It's active, it's swirling, very natural looking figures. And this is the last work of Raphael. It's a famous painting and a much beloved painting. And you have in the foreground, you have this figure that needs healing, this wild boy that's being held by this man that is in this kind of that greenish robe. There's lots of color in this, which is great. And it's huge. There's tons of movement. And you also have that moment of transfiguration where Christ literally lights up and the apostles realize that they are that they are in front of Christ. It really confronts them with the reality of who he is. And there again, they're kind of thrown back in wonder. But it has, again, kind of the heaven, kind of the apostles of where they're realizing who he is, and then you have the masses below. The woman in the peach and the blue almost adds this kind of classical look to it. It has that definite Renaissance feel to it. She has that almost sculptural look to her. Now this has labels, so you can kind of see the key figures: Moses, Elijah, apostles James, Peter, and John. There's the symbols of faith, hope, and love. And there is the again, that kind of wild and possessed child that needs healing. And then in the bottom corner is believed to be Matthew or Andrew. But lots of activity in it, and it always attracts a crowd. Justice and pastor are on the side, and they are saints that have the same feast date as the Transfiguration, which that was kind of interesting. This is the lower detail of Raphael's famous Transfiguration of Christ. You can see it in the side there. And then also in this painting, it shows a detail of the Transfiguration of Christ. Unfinished at his death, friends Romano and Penny probably finished the lower right corner. Cleaning in the 1970s indicated most of it is probably Raphael's work. And so here you see this a deathbed scene of Raphael. Now there's some conjecture that classical looking woman that looks sculptural, and she's in this slight contrapposto position, is the Magdalene, and the Mary Magdalene. And I think that's entirely possible, but again, there's some mystery. This also is a cartoon of St. Philip and St. Andrew, and a study of the apostle below in the corner as well. So you can see a little bit of his artistic process. Cleansing of the temple. Jesus returns to Jerusalem, where he finds money changers and merchants doing business in the temple, in his father's house. And he gets very, very angry. And this is where he chases the money lenders out of the temple. And there's so much action. You have this strong diagonal. He's reaching back, has this kind of a ropey, I don't know, some sort of weapon in his hand, something he just grabbed, and you see again everyone just going every which direction in the face of his anger. So he uses this gesture very, very similar to Michelangelo's Christ figure in the Last Judgment that was created near the end of Michelangelo's life. You see his hand raised up, and you also see his hand, and again this kind of ropey weapon in his hand, like a, I don't know, like some sort of a broom-like. It almost looks like flagellants sometimes use these kind of whips to whip their self. Flagellants were people that were sinners, and they felt like they needed to punish them. It wasn't enough to ask for forgiveness. They needed to be punished physically, and so they would actually go down the streets, whipping their backs, often during plague or some sort of really traumatic event. This is a Byzantine example of the Transfiguration, and Jesus scales a mountain in the presence of Peter and 2 other disciples, is transformed into radiant life. And here you see a very stylized example, completely different from all the swirling dynamic, everything going on that you have in Raphael's final work. So Matthew, during Passover, Christ drove out the sellers of sacrificial animals and the money exchangers. Passeri imagined the temple as a lavish structure in the ancient classical style. It's chaotic, it's multifigural. There is this very, very expressive gestures, and it's just like a snapshot, and really beautiful. And there is also this nimbus or halo of light around Christ as well. This is Durr, Albrecht Durr's Christ's entry into Jerusalem, associated with Palm Sunday in Christian liturgy. On the Sunday before his crucifixion, Christ goes into Jerusalem on a donkey. Again, not a horse, a humble donkey. Northern Renaissance, internationally known, and interest in careful, exact proportion and details. There's a very careful precision to Durr's work. He was a successful artist in his lifetime. That doesn't always happen in art, as you know. And in fact, Vasari was very enamored with the skills of Durr as well. And then opposite here, on the other side, you have Duccio, who is a medieval artist, and this is Christ's entry into Jerusalem as well. But more multi-figured, very, very colorful, people climbing into trees to see what's going on. Really interesting as well. And here you also see the depiction of space is definitely developing. Giotto and Duccio are right in there with each other as far as that goes. Christ before the high priest, Gerrit von Honthorst, and this is 17th century. He's one of the Caravaggisti. You see that beautiful brown tonal background. You see that beautiful light that shines upon Christ's face. as he looks at the high priest, Caiaphas, and he was brought there by Roman soldiers, and they're questioning him about his teachings and saying that his doctrine is false. And so this is one of the most famous paintings of Honthorst in Rome, and it's really, really gorgeous. Honthorst is a Dutch artist, a Dutch Caravaggisti, sometimes also called the Utrecht Caravaggisti. So beautiful lighting. That internal light source of that candle reflecting on the faces is really beautiful. It has what they call tenebroso, which means this murky lighting. The viewer is invited to participate because of the way in which it's open in between the two figures. You're essentially right up in the action. And so beautiful artist, one of my very favorites of the Caravaggisti. The Rossano Gospels, this is Christ before Pilate. After the high priest, Christ goes before Pilate, and he's a Roman governor. Jesus is accused of treason because he was proclaimed King of the Jews by the people. Pilate asked the crowd to choose between freeing Jesus or Barabbas, a murderer. And he really thought that the crowd would, without question, would choose Barabbas, but they didn't. And inexplicably, Jesus is chosen. And so Pilate, who's very upset by this, is basically symbolically washing his hands through eternity because of that decision. And so this idea of never being able to rid himself of that guilt is one of the moralistic tales about Pilate. So of course you have to have the Last Supper, and this is of course Leonardo da Vinci. It is a fresco in Milan. You're not going to see it in any museum. It's on the wall. It's actually in the refectory in a dining hall, and it's been through a lot. It's had tremendous amount of restoration work, so much so that some people say it doesn't even have the hand of Leonardo da Vinci anymore, but it certainly has the designs. And you have the apostles grouped into triangles on both sides. If any of you saw the Da Vinci Code, it's complete fiction. The figure on his right is John the Evangelist. Beautiful, one that Christ is said to love best, one that was entrusted to watch and take care of Mary after Christ's death. And here you also see that moment when Christ says, "One of you will betray me," and they are at this symbolic Eucharist where there is bread and there's wine, and they're basically taking communion, a communion with Christ. And this is that moment where he says, "One of you will betray me," and they're just startled, and they're throwing themselves back, and they're saying, "Is it me? Is it me? You know, no, it's not me." And their gestures are interesting to look at. And in fact, Da Vinci actually studied a great deal of expressions, trying to get the right expressions, and it took him a while to produce this. Judas is the dark-haired one with the sharp features that is right next to John the Evangelist. And you also have Simon Peter behind him. And he's actually holding a money bag. And so you know that he has been given money in exchange for telling the soldiers where Christ is. So it's at the Santa Maria delle Grazie, and it was done in tempera. Even in his lifetime, it was degrading. It wasn't stable. He was experimental. He loved to do different things, and it did not do very, very well at all in the last 500 years. So consequently, it did need restoration work. Adjusting the light here. Here they're labeled for you. It's a whole lot easier. Uh, Bartholomew, James and Andrew, sons of Alphaeus, Simon Peter, Judas, John the Evangelist, again, not the Magdalene, even though it's a beautiful, beautiful figure. He's said to have been a beautiful man. Of course, Christ. You have Thomas, you have James, Philip, Matthew, um, uh, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. And then you have this really incredible sense of perspective as this room goes in. And then there's this landscape in the back. It's a beautiful, beautiful work, and it's definitely showing a lot of the important developments of the Renaissance. And the main thing that's happening here is he is preparing the apostles for what is going to happen here soon. Ancient image from the catacombs at St. Calixtus. It's about 120 feet under the ground, and you go into this tour. Such a remarkable scent too. It's not a bad scent, it's just a different scent. And this is around early 3rd century, and it depicts this Last Supper, or it may be a communion. This is really not that big. It's pretty small, but it's pretty cool as well. El Greco, Agony in the Garden. This shows Christ's humanity. He goes to the Mount of Olives to pray and prepare. He struggles to overcome his fear of death for praying for divine strength. He's Christ as a man, and he's in pain and he's struggling. He complains that his apostles are all sleeping in his moment of need because a deep sleep came upon them when they went up to the Mount of Olives. And so here you can see the entire work, and then you can see a detail of the work as well. So his full name is Dominicos Theotokos. I'm not even going to attempt it. We just call him El Greco. That's fine. And his figures are extremely expressive, and there's a lot of modern qualities to his work. His figures often have a kind of bluish, grayish image to them as well, as far as the palette. They're very, very expressive. They're very mannerist, not to scale at all. And it's kind of a cave where the apostles are asleep. I wrote like puppies, but yeah, kind of unaware. And this is kind of this dark night of the soul. He's questioning, he's wondering, he's anxious, and he knows that his end is near. Agony in the Garden by Mantegna, early Renaissance. Figures are starting to look more realistic, mannerist, exaggerated as far as size, and certain aspects are larger. Scale isn't quite right, a lot of artistic license. And you also have Judas in the background leading people to Christ as well. And here he's praying to God, and you have, of course, the angels holding a cross in the heavens above. And the tree, of course, later Judas hangs himself, and so the tree, that very, very barren tree, it would be symbolic of that. And then you have the dark bird on top as well, just in case you miss it. Okay, see the details a little closer there. So there's some new growth, just a little bit of new growth on the tree that may indicate a hopeful sign that not all is not complete despair. There's an equestrian statue, and it looks very, very Roman in the background, as far as like a Roman fortress in the background as well. And then, of course, the figures in the foreground that are just passed out. Initially, this was attributed to Hieronymus Bosch. Now they believe it was painted in the manner or after Hieronymus Bosch by Van Schilder. Christ's face is beautiful, refined, and the other faces are evil looking, and it's haunting and it's creeping, this mocking of Christ as they are all around him, and yet he at this point seems at peace. Here you can see some of the details as well. So perhaps the most truly puzzling work is Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, Northern Renaissance. The garden is the sinful world, and there is hell at the end as well. So the garden, this weird world, and then the hell, again in one large, very complex triptych. This is Surrealism centuries before Surrealism. It's really nothing quite like it. The really weird structures, it's said that Bosch's family worked with fountains and hydraulics, and so some of these unusual mechanisms may be related to that. But there's not a lot known about him, and you have people in all kinds of weird positions. You have lots of fruit. Fruit was a luxury item, and there, again, it's a really unique work. So it's a triptych. Most likely they think it was probably too much for a church and would have been moved to a private residence, and it's really quite haunting. The first panel's fairly peaceful. I mean, you see these really exotic animals. You see Adam and Eve in the garden, but everything goes wrong in the second panel. You see people in all sorts of weird gestures and poses, and giant strawberries and giant fruits, and oh yeah, it's baffling. It's a truly baffling work. And then you have like something out of a nightmare or a horror movie in the third. Erwin Panofsky said, "I cannot help feeling that the real secret of his magnificent nightmares and daydreams has still to be disclosed." I think this is true. It's baffling, but it is surrealism, just centuries before surrealism. It's that dark night of the soul. It's this really weird stuff. Fruit, again, shows up in a number of ways. It looks like people are having sex, but they never quite get there. But there is a kind of scatological references, a lot of images of buttocks, lots of weird fruit and weird, there's an oyster with its legs hanging out of it. But Freud must have loved Bosch. All kinds of interesting imagery. This is 14th century stained glass, St. Wilhelm in the interior, the Tree of Jesse, which is the lineage of Christ, with Life of Christ window. And it's, again, around after 1307, so early 14th century. Here is a detail of Christ receiving the kiss from Judas, who betrays him, of course. The figures in here almost look animalistic, and I think it's because it's really hard to get a natural look of the figures in stained glass, but they really do look animalistic. It's an intriguing image. Caravaggio, again, he does a number of these. And so this is the denial of St. Peter, and it is that moment where a woman says, "Aren't you the?" And then there's also a soldier nearby, and he immediately starts denying that he was with Christ. And so this is St. Peter in a very, very human way. And not only did he do it once, but he did it 3 different times. But it was also prophesied by Christ that he would deny him 3 times. So this was part of prophecy as well. Yet Peter is considered the first pope and the rock that built the church. He is often shown with the keys to the church because he was one of the first to, of course, recognize Christ. Sharp chiaroscuro, light dark contrast, and it is this really unique spiritual light and darkness that's going on here with this dappled life, and he's denying him, is kind of pointing at himself, and it also has that murkiness in the background, which is called tenebroso. Mocking of Christ. This is at the Getty. Roman soldiers held Christ captive and whipped him, again this flagellation, and mocked him by dressing him as the king of the Jews. And internal light source, this naturalism, and he produced this around 1617 to 20. This is a large work. It's a work that you look at and it's massive, and it brings the viewer in, and you become essentially one of the tormentors of Christ. And so it's really haunting, especially because you see this intensely looking evil face, and then you see the light of Christ with his thorns, and the one above him is pushing the thorns down and torturing him as well. And then there's these shadowy figures in the back. This is a detail with the internal light source, very much part of the Caravaggisti. Carrying of the cross, raising of the cross. These were themes in the life of Christ. The Romans forced Jesus to carry this cross on which he will be crucified through the town. Jesus' mother, John the Evangelist, and Mary Magdalene mourn and cry at the base of the cross. And Jesus dies on Good Friday. This is by Orazio Gentileschi, who to a certain extent was a follower of Caravaggio, but his daughter Artemisia even more so. The Grunwald altarpiece, this is 1510, and here you have the Mother Mary, John the Evangelist, John the Baptist is here, even though he'd already died, but he is on the other side, and he is pointing at Christ as the true way. And then the Magdalene is at the base. This is also called the Eisenheim altarpiece, and it is at the Hospital of St. Anthony. It was believed that this tortuous, he's kind of greenish looking figure of Christ in a hospital setting might make people feel better because of Christ's pain and suffering. It would give them comfort. Now, I don't know that this would give a lot of people comfort. Maybe. But yes, I think more often in hospitals you see flowers and landscapes and things like that. But yes, it was believed this would be comforting. And I guess for the truly very, very religious person, it might. But it's very tortuous. You can see rigor mortis is set in on the fingers. He looks stretched. He looks elongated. And here it is, the entire thing. So really incredible work. So here we have John the Baptist, who appears to be saying, he must become greater, I must become less. And so, but of course, he'd already passed on. And you have the sacrificial lamb, the Lamb of God, with holding a cross in the foreground with a cup as well, blood of Christ. And so this was a figure that was usually shown looking kind of wild and craggy. It was sometimes shown in furs. It was said that he ate lotus and honey, and he has this wild look to him. So here's again the full view of the altarpiece, and this was the main point of St. Anthony's was to help people that were suffering from a disease called St. Anthony's fire. And this basically was poisoning caused by consuming infected grain. So it was pretty preventable, but they didn't exactly know what caused it. So. Left panel shows Saint Sebastian the martyr, and he's shown with arrows because those are symbols of his martyrdom. You also have Saint Anthony the hermit on the other side, and the predella shows the entombment of Christ. And Christ has been taken from the cross. Pontormo, Descent from the Cross, 1528. Jesus' mother, John the Evangelist, and Mary Magdalene were there at the end. Pontormo's masterpiece, Renaissance, very mannerist and elongated. I like that figure of Christ is very much so. That angel that's holding him looks kind of awkward, like he's an extremely long torso. So mannerism is definitely something that Pontormo is doing here as well, just like he's done in other works too. Pontormo's Descent from the Cross. Here you can see a different view of it. And so different periods, same theme, motif. This one has that definitely the light sherbety color that Pontormo was kind of known for. Lamentation or Descent from the Cross by Derek Bouts, Northern Renaissance, oil on wood. You don't have quite the development of the human figure here, as you're going to see later in the Renaissance. The figure of Christ looks downright emaciated. It looks extremely thin. And it's out of scale. The Magdalene is at the foot of the cross behind the Virgin, who's dressed in blue. Remember, Queen of Heaven and Mother of Christ. And then you also have James the Evangelist that has his hand on Mary and is comforting him. Remember, that was what he was charged with, was to take care of his mother after his death. So it's a traditional motif of after the death of Christ, descent from the cross. So this is Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, Baroque artist, example of the deposition of the cross. Figure of Christ is being moved off. The staring face at us is Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is also a self-portrait of Michelangelo, the sculptor and producer of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And so it is a bit of an ode to Michelangelo of the Renaissance. And interestingly enough, Michelangelo Buonarroti did produce a self-portrait of himself as Nicodemus in the famous Domo Pietà, or deposition of Christ. And so here you see him being taken off of the cross in sculpture. But again, it's a self-portrait of Michelangelo Buonarroti. And then again, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio actually uses his face in the Baroque work as well, which I think is pretty interesting. And so that's a self-portrait of Nicodemus. And then behind him, you see the evangelist. You see John the Evangelist. Remember, he was to care for the Virgin. And you have the three Marys standing behind this grouping, this diagonal. You have the Virgin Mary, and you have Mary of Cleopas, and then you also have Mary of Magdalene. Just to get really confusing, but sometimes they're simply called the three Marys because they were present at the deposition, and it is a real tradition in art history to see that grouping. So Derek Bout's Lamentation. Again, the realism is getting there as far as space and whatnot, but nothing near like it's going to get by the Baroque period. 1520s, you have Renaissance, you have mannerism, and this kind of sherbet color that actually predates the Rococo, which definitely goes into this palette. But even so, it's got a lot of naturalism to it as well. And then, of course, Caravaggio with its all this movement, very Baroque, and of course, he was extremely influential artist. Andrea Mantegna, Dead Christ, Lamentation over the Dead Christ, 1480. So this is an example of foreshortening, which is a method. I'll give you the official meaning. Method of rendering a specific object or figure in depth. But it looks awkward, but we're at a unique vantage point. It also shows the Virgin as being pretty old looking because she was quite young when she had Christ, and he died at 33. And so I think they make her look a little bit older than she might have been. But I think they also might be trying to demonstrate her acute pain as well. But this is also an example of mannerism as well. So in a letter written to the Duke of Mantua, Ludovico Mantegna mentioned a Christ in foreshortening among the works left by his father. Date, probably around 470s. It was in Mantegna's studio for a long time. It may have been intended for his funeral. Later, it was acquired by the powerful Gonzaga family. And Sister Wendy, in one of her videos, talks about the fact that it was a rather homely family. Indeed, portraits do show that they don't seem to have the handsome members that you get in the Medicis. So this is one of the key works at Norton Simon, in my opinion. It's amazing. Now, one thing that's interesting about it is you do see the Virgin here is shown in purple, which is unusual. It is a color for royalty. So usually, again, the iconography was white, burgundy, red, or blue. So red, white, or blue. And the model for the women appears to be his first wife, Isabella Brandt. And it's just a gorgeous work. It's fairly large. It's that moment when the angels greet the ladies, and it should be noted it's women that discover that Christ has arisen, and word spreads. And they meet them at the tomb and say he isn't here. And it's a pretty cool moment in Christianity. And so lots of drama, and again, the movements are so interesting. Again, the woman lifting her veil. It's just beautiful, and it's not to be missed. So you can see a little larger here. But she shows up a lot in his artwork, which was quite lovely, and unfortunately did not live to be very old, which was not uncommon for women. They had a pretty high mortality rate. He ultimately ends up marrying her niece a few years later. So, and then he has an additional 5 children. So, wow. So, very often in his images. In fact, in the Assumption of the Virgin, here we again see Isabella Brandt. In some, I mean, sometimes the features are a little different, the hair is a little different, but you see her face over and over and over again. I think it's one of the more endearing things I like about Rubens. He really loved his first wife, and he was pretty passionate about his second. But that's a different story. And so anyway, his second wife was Helene Formant, who was only 16. He was well into his 50s. Assumption of the Virgin Mary, 1626. Here you can see some details of it. So it's on the high altar at the Cathedral of Our Lady in Antwerp. Rubens was an internationally renowned artist. He was very well known. He was welcome in many, many courts. He was a foreign diplomat. Some thought he might have even been doing some spying. And this is the moment when Mary is taken up into heaven. It's after her death. And according to some of the apocryphal stories, indeed, all of the apostles were gathered to her from all the different places of the earth, and just in a mystical experience were present at her death. And so it is that moment where she gets to see them all again, and she is lifted up and gets to be with her son and certainly with God. So a kneeling woman holds a flower, referring to the lilies that miraculously filled her empty coffin. So separate Emmaus, that moment where Luke and Cleopas are on the road to Emmaus, and they meet a stranger. And Christ does not reveal himself. It's after the crucifixion. And they take this stranger in with them to this inn. You see them having food, breaking bread, and enjoying each other. And this sounds weird to us, the idea of just taking a stranger off the road and having a meal with them. But that was typical, because probably for safety largely. People would stay in groups, especially on when they were traveling. But it was simply the tradition to basically be welcome and open to strangers. And it also, some of this taking care of a guest or a stranger actually comes from a Greco-Roman tradition as well. And so this is that during the 40 days between Christ's resurrection and his ascent to heaven, he appeared to his followers, and in this was one of the events where he appears. And so they don't recognize him. They're sitting down to a meal, and then the scales fall from their eyes, and they look upon him, and they realize who it is, and they lean back. They're startled. Now the servers, they don't see it. They don't know what's going on. It's very much something that is between him and his followers. In fact, the woman behind them looks pretty downtrodden and pretty tired, and the man standing next to him looks like, are you ready to order? Meanwhile, Christ appears to them, and then is said to have very shortly after disappeared. Now, he did produce this one earlier, and this is the one that's perhaps more famous. I personally like the other one better, but again, this is very, very well thought of. You see the still life of the fruit that looks remarkably like some of Caravaggio's early works. You don't have that tenebroso, that diffused light in the background that you had in the other example. And again, the gesture is bigger and the colors are bolder, and I think that's why it's more popular. Here's an example. It's beautiful still life. So here you can see early, you can see Supper at Emmaus done later. You have Judith and Holofernes, which is, Judith is this heroine, an apocryphal story where she cuts off the head of an Assyrian king, and it's also considered one of his great masterpieces. And then you also have a much later work in the bottom corner. You again see how much psychology there is in this work, how diffused it is. I think it's much more subtle than the more popular example of his First Supper. Rembrandt also was profoundly influenced by the Caravaggisti. And here you can see him absorbing certainly some of the palette. He even gets more brown than Caravaggio. But he also very much understood light imagery, especially when depicting the Christ, as he's shown here with this nimbus around his head. Ascension of Christ by Garofalo, 1520, and then Transfiguration. He's definitely clearly inspired by Raphael's work, but it doesn't have the same power or the same details of Raphael. So Raphael, Garofalo, again, you can see the connection to the two, but you can also see that Raphael's skill was pronouncedly better. But even so, it does tell the story of Christ's ascension. And so I thought that would be a good way to end this. So lots of information, lots of stories, and again, tip of the iceberg, because there's so much more.